I'm TJ Poor, Director of Regulated Utility Planning at the Public Service Department. And this webinar and webinar series is intended to ground you all and attendees in basic information on Vermont's electricity from multiple vantage points. Before we start, a little bit about us. We're an agency within the branch of government, the executive branch of government. Our commissioner, June Tierney, is a member of the governor's cabinet. Our agency is charged with representing the public interest in matters regarding energy, telecommunications, water, and wastewater. We do that in a number of ways, including advocating for the public interest in utility cases before the Public Utility Commission. They are a separate entity, a kind of quasi-court that's the deciding body in utility matters. And by providing long-range planning for the state's energy and telecommunications needs through the state's comprehensive energy plan and Vermont's telecommunications plan. All this is with the goal of meeting the public's need for least cost, environmentally sound, reliable energy systems in both the short and the long term. Today, we have a number of key staff from the department are here to help facilitate this webinar. It's a really great crew, and it's really part of what makes my job enjoyable on a day-to-day basis is getting to work with people like these every day. I'll just introduce the first of this group, Claire McElvany, who's our Data and Equity Policy Manager, who will take us through some logistics for today's webinar and set some context for today's discussion.
Thanks, TJ. So as we get started, we just wanted to cover a few basic logistics. We're asking that folks remain muted with your video off throughout the webinar, seeing as we have a reasonably large crowd and want to make sure that we just make the best use of our bandwidth. We have multiple points throughout the presentation where we have built-in pauses for clarifying questions and then a longer discussion or in-depth question session at the end. So we welcome you to write questions in the chat box as they come up, or if you're unable to do so, we encourage you to raise your hand and ask questions directly when we come to those points throughout the presentation. If you'd like to ask your question directly, you can press unmute or *6 once you've been called on by our facilitator. We wanted to highlight that closed captioning is available today, if that would be of assistance to you. Just please be aware that the captions are auto-generated and might not be 100% accurate. And then lastly, we are recording today's session, which will be posted on the department's renewables website shortly after this event, along with copies of the slides, which are actually already posted. Next slide, please. So as TJ mentioned, we wanted to provide some context for the webinar series that we've kickstarted this week. It's part of a broader effort we're currently conducting to review our state electricity policies and programs as recommended by our 2022 Comprehensive Energy Plan and the state's 2021 Climate Action Plan, which both highlight that as we begin to meet more of our heating and transportation needs with electricity, that we want to make sure that that electricity is coming from renewable or low carbon resources to help us achieve our greenhouse gas reduction requirements and renewable energy goals. So throughout this process, we are really looking to hear from folks like you to better understand what Vermonters think is important about our state electricity policies and programs. And we've outlined sort of 3 different phases of engagement that we hope to conduct throughout the next year as we review these policies and programs. We're currently in the first phase, offering educational opportunities and beginning to hear from Vermonters about what matters most to you with regards to your electricity. As we get into later spring and summer, we'll be having more in-depth conversations about our current policies and how we might want to change them to meet our clean energy and climate objectives. And then as we head into the fall and early winter, we'll be writing up recommendations that we'll be providing to the Vermont legislature before the next session. So throughout this year, there'll be a variety of ways to be involved, and we hope you'll continue to join us. Next slide, please. So as TJ mentioned, we're hoping that today's webinar will help kind of ground those present and who attended the session earlier this week and some foundational questions and information on our electric system today. So we'll be covering some basic information around how the electric grid delivers electricity to Vermont homes and businesses. And then from there, consider a number of different perspectives on where Vermont's electricity comes from. Next slide, please. But before we get into those sort of two points, we wanted to start with a couple icebreakers to help us, one, better understand who's in the audience and kind of gauge where folks are with regards to your knowledge about our electric system today. Next slide, please. So in a moment, my colleague Philip is going to pull up a poll, but we're really hoping to learn a little bit about who's in the audience today, as one of the goals that the department has for this process is to engage with a broader array of Vermonters than we've historically reached with our event. So as part of that effort, we have a few questions here to help better understand who's in the audience and the perspectives you're bringing to the table. We wanted to highlight that answering any of the questions in the poll is completely voluntary, so feel free to answer as many or as few as you feel comfortable doing so, and all the responses will be anonymous. But any information you are willing to share will be helpful both for us internally as we help inform our outreach efforts moving forward, but also in our reports on the process to be transparent about who we did and didn't hear from, and offer some context for recommendations. So I'll ask Philip to bring up the poll, and I'll just mention there are 8 questions here total, so you'll likely have to scroll down to review all of them. But these again aim to kind of give us a better sense of who's in the audience and who we're reaching, and then also give you a chance to get familiar with the polling tool, which we'll be using a couple of times throughout today. So we'll give folks a few minutes to review the questions and answer what you feel comfortable. So yeah. Great, looks like we have a number of responses coming in. Just that reminder that as you work through the poll, you can scroll down and then there should be a submit button once you've completed all of your answers. We'll just give another moment or two. Last call for answers to this poll, and then we'll have Philip close it so we can move on to the next one. All right, Philip, you can go ahead and close the poll. Next slide, please. And really appreciate, again, you taking the time to share that information with us. It will be helpful in informing our efforts moving forward. So the next poll, before we dive into some of the core substance of today, is actually looking to hear from who's in the audience, where you stand in terms of understanding our electric system. So there's 2 questions in this poll. One, looking at where do you think Vermont's electricity comes from, and the second on how renewable do you think Vermont's electricity is? So Philip, if you can launch that poll. Again, there should be 2 questions and you may have to scroll again before submitting. And Chris, it looks like you have switched, just so you know, into the presenter view. If you're able to switch back. There you go. Thank you. All right, and looks like we're seeing a number of responses, so maybe just a few more moments. And Philip, you can close the poll in just, a second or two. Great. You want to share results quickly and then we'll move on. We'll pass it back to TJ. It looks like for the first question, most folks, majority saying about 33% in Vermont, 36% from resources outside Vermont is where electricity comes from. And for the second, most folks looking at 59% Vermont electricity is renewable. So we actually are not going to offer answers right now. I think there's some complexity in how you might answer these questions, and I'm going to pass it back to TJ, who will touch on this through the next several slides. To you, TJ.
Right. Thanks, Claire. And yeah, it is important that those polls were set up to set the stage for some of the information we'll share here. In a lot of respects, it depends on your perspective, and we'll get into that a little bit here. But before we get into where Vermont's electricity comes from, we want to talk just for a second about how the electric system works. I'm not going to be talking about the mechanics of turbines here or how solar panels create electricity. I'm not an engineer, and that wouldn't go well. So instead, we'll talk about how the power we rely on every day gets to Vermont homes, businesses, and communities. And we'll talk about the sources that produce it. The slide on your screen shows the core components of the electric system. So moving from left to right here, we can start by thinking about what happens in our homes and businesses when we flip a light switch or we turn on an appliance like an electric stove. The electricity needed to help us run those regular household items flows through the distribution lines that you see locally outside your home and around town, and possibly through transmission lines as well, which carry power from further away. Think of the distribution lines really as your city, towns, and city and town streets, and the transmission lines more as state highways, where large amounts of electricity can move quickly over those highways, the transmission lines, and then we step down, get off the exit of the highway and step down to the distribution lines to move around town and get around to our final destination. So these poles and wires move electricity from generation sources, which produce electricity. Examples of those include solar power, wind farms, hydropower plants, or more traditional fossil fuel plants powered by fuels like oil or natural gas. Now this chart here, or this slide, is a real simple depiction and really just intended to highlight core components of what's really a complex system. And within that, this kind of traditional flow of power, really from generation to consumers, has started to shift over the last decade in particular. New technologies are evolving to give customers the opportunity to generate electricity or store it for use at their home and within their communities. Next slide, please. So that shift is really impacting how far the poles and wires and those electric highways and streets must carry the electricity. And of course, it depends on where those resources are located. That varies and includes generating sources that are close to the customer, like solar panels on our homes, our community solar arrays down the street, or local hydroelectric dams. Within Vermont broadly, like the large hydro dams on the Connecticut River, or from outside of the state in the New England region, or in other regions like New York, or from across the border in Canada. How far the poles and wires carry electricity varies not only where that generation is located, but also depending on the amount of consumer demand and the amount of available generation from particular resources at that time of the demand. So if you think about a sunny spring day, might be nice to think about with the cold weather coming tomorrow, but solar panels may be generating a lot of power during the day, while at the same time, Your local hydroelectric dam is benefiting from the spring runoff and generating as much as it can. It's early May, so you've already shut off your heat, but you also haven't turned on an air conditioner, so your demand for electricity is low. Generation within your community may be sufficient to actually meet your need at that time. And now think about the end of a long cold snap in February, like, we're gonna have this weekend, but imagine it even a week longer, where it hasn't gotten above 5 degrees for a week and you haven't seen the sun in days. The rivers could be largely frozen, slowing that hydro production, and solar isn't producing as much. Power may need to come from further away. That may be other resources in Vermont, bigger hydro facilities, less affected by the cold, from plants fueled by biomass in the region, or imports from those neighboring states or areas outside of New England. If you go to the next slide, please. So when power travels from those generating stations to the consumer, it is important to understand who is managing that. You all are likely familiar with your distribution utility. That's who you pay your electric bill to. That includes private entities like Green Mountain Power, who on that graphic on the left side of your screen is the light green area. It covers most of Vermont. And it could be local cooperatives like Vermont Electric Cooperative and Washington Electric Cooperative, or it could be from a municipality who owns their own electric utility. There's 14 of those in the state, and that includes municipalities like Burlington, Northfield, Ludlow, Swanton, Enosburg, those spread around the state. These distribution utilities acquire and deliver electricity to your home or business each day. Now, when the electricity needs to move over the highways or the transmission lines, that involves Velco, who is Vermont's lone transmission utility and owns and operates those high voltage transmission lines that connect the utilities within Vermont and connect Vermont to other states and provinces. Velco is actually owned by the distribution utilities. It's an arrangement that's unique to Vermont, at least in New England, where other transmission companies are for-profit companies. That graphic in the center of the screen is probably a little hard to see, but it shows Velco's transmission network. Now, the graphic on the right side of the screen is ISO New England, and that's the nonprofit organization that manages the flow of electricity through the New England region. And that they ensure available electricity every minute of every hour of every day. They also run the energy markets where wholesale power is purchased and sold in Vermont. Won't talk a whole lot about wholesale energy markets today, but I think it's good to know they have that other role. But for today, they're really the ones that dispatch the power and make sure that the grid is remaining reliable. ISO New England is, we think about ISO New England as a grid because it's really high voltage transmission lines, and they manage the imports into and out of New England. That same, they manage the imports in and out of different states, but it's not not in the same manner that they're really just high voltage transmission lines for the most part that connect us to other areas. So New England kind of acts as a whole. There's a mid-Atlantic independent system operator like ISO New England that manages for mid-Atlantic states, and then there's several other across the country. Next slide, please. So we really, that was really high level on how Vermont's electricity moves from generation to its consumer end use. Before we go on to talk more specifically about where Vermont's electricity comes from, we wanted to just pause here to take any clarifying questions on the information that we just covered in the last couple of slides. I think Chris is going to help facilitate the chat. If you could enter any questions into the chat, and we can take questions.
Got one question here for you, TJ. So far, it's asking what utility covers the gray area in the northern part of the state.
That is Vermont Electric Co-op covers most of the northern part of the state. So they have a probably the second biggest territory by acreage, or but much more rural territory.
We've got a bit of a quiet crowd tonight. It looks like I've got just got the one question. I can go into some questions that we had from the earlier session. Got a comment about plus Hardwick Electric. I think that probably hides in there with some of the other smaller utilities on the northern part of the state as well.
Right. I think right. Hardwick Electric covers, I think, several municipalities including Hardwick, but also surrounding, like Wolcott and Greensboro and several others in that area.
Question asking about Hydro-Quebec, which I think we'll get into in the next session a little bit more. There's a question about Burlington Electric Department and asking whether it's considered a nonprofit.
Yeah, it's owned by the municipality, so it is not for profit. It it's when it makes a capital investment, it usually needs to support that investment through either eventually through rates, but also through potentially through a bond from city taxpayers. Ultimately, the taxpayers of the city are kind of the backstop for Burlington Electric, and we will talk about Hydro-Quebec in the next session. So if we don't answer your question, please ask it again.
I've got here's one. Can you explain how the department fits into the power scheme in Vermont? What is the difference between the department and the PUC, and how do the two interact with the legislature?
Sure. So the department wears two hats, actually. So one hat is we are the ratepayer advocate in regulated utility matters. So that Public Utility Commission is the regulatory body that decides and adjudicates utility matters. And so, for instance, when a utility wants to build a transmission line, like Velco wants to build a transmission line, or generation needs to is proposed to be sited, the Public Utility Commission is the one that decides upon that. And the Department of Public Service advocates in the interest of consumers as guided by statute. So there's a number of statutory provisions that run the process there, but we're guided by in our advocacy by state energy policy. And as I said earlier, we're a branch of we're an agency of the executive branch, so we're guided by the administration's policy in our advocacy. And so Vermont energy policy is laid out in statute, and we advocate to try and best balance the different components of energy policy. We're completely different entities, although we're housed in the same building, but we're completely separate entities. So we mostly see the Public Utility Commission in their hearing room. In terms of how we interact at the legislature, the commission usually goes and will answer questions and often does not advocate because they essentially are directed by the legislature and the statute. The department, on the other hand, does advocate based on the administration's priorities before the legislature.
Okay, we've got a couple other here. Do utilities ever sell poles and lines to one another, or are the territories frozen in perpetuity?
It happens occasionally, but for the most part, utility service territories are fixed. And so, occasionally some utilities are sold to others completely and absorbed, essentially, like when Central Vermont Public Service merged with Green Mountain Power, they became Green Mountain Power. So, and there has been some small utilities over the last couple of decades that have been purchased by either Vermont Electric Co-op or Green Mountain Power. Reedsboro Electric Department comes to mind. A small electric utility in the southern part of the state. Occasionally, if on the border of a utility territory, that it may, it may serve both entities' interest, both utilities and the customer's interest for one utility or the other to actually serve that customer. And so they may go through a proceeding to clarify whose customer that is. But those are kind of rare instances. And for the most part in Vermont, that, if you're a Green Mountain Power customer, you're going to continue to be a Green Mountain Power customer.
There's a couple other questions here that we'll probably cover a little further on. Can you talk about how the state can impact policies at ISO New England at all?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Sorry, can you talk about how the state of Vermont can impact ISO New England's policies?
Sure. So ISO New England is the grid operator, and it is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So they take their direction from FERC is the acronym, and they also have to comply with National Electricity Reliability Council rules and regulations to ensure reliability across the region. So they need to comply. As you can imagine, those regulations are not 100% clear all of the time. ISO New England holds many committee meetings on the electricity markets, on reliability planning, transmission planning. The department participates in those meetings both directly and then through an organization called the New England States Committee on Electricity, which is offices like the Department of Public Service around New England in each of the 6 New England states that get together and discuss the issues that are up for decision or discussion at ISO New England, and we advocate through that group. Their acronym is NESCO, New England States Committee on Electricity. There's other, and so I think those are the two main ways. We also do have the Vermont System Planning Committee in Vermont that is a group of, it's made up of all of our electric utilities and our transmission utility, but also has stakeholders from our energy efficiency utilities like Efficiency Vermont, environmental advocates, and public representatives that are appointed by the Public Utility Commission. And we have discussions in that group, and it's kind of a good venue to vet issues that then get taken to ISO New England.
I think I got time for one more here. Does Vermont regulate for-profit and non-profit utilities differently?
We're one of the few states that actually regulates municipal utilities in mostly the same way. There are different structures for Green Mountain Power as the really the only for-profit utility in Vermont. than for some of the municipal utilities. And part of that is due to their size. Part of it is because they are a for-profit entity. And but most states for municipal utilities don't have rate regulation at all. And when we talk about regulation, we're often talking about rate regulation. These entities, because their service territories are fixed, like I was talking about earlier, they, they're monopolies. And so that's why their rates are regulated. For the most part, our rate regulation is consistent across utilities.
Right. Well, I guess I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you. All really good questions. And if please reach out to us afterwards if our the answers are not clear, or if you're confused for any reason, because we want. One of the main purposes of this is to kind of get this kind of information out there and make it accessible. Okay, so if you go on to the next slide. So the rest of the presentation will show data that illustrates where Vermont's electricity comes from. There's several ways to approach this question, and we'll look at it a number of different ways. We're going to look at what electricity Vermont generates in the state physically. We're going to look at what electricity gets generated in the rest of New England for context, including Vermont, the whole of New England. We'll look at what electricity Vermont utilities own or buy, or have entitlements to, is another way to say that. And what are the renewable characteristics of Vermont's electricity? And we'll talk about renewable energy certificates and how that plays into the accounting for our portfolio of resources. So before we start, I just want to go over some terminology here to make sure that we're not talking past each other. So in electric speak, we often use the terms kilowatt or megawatt, kilowatt hour or megawatt hour. A kilowatt or a megawatt is really a measure of power, how much electricity something needs to turn on or can generate instantaneously. A kilowatt hour or a megawatt hour is a measure of energy, and that is the amount of power delivered or generated over a time period, over an hour. So everyone here has an electric bill. Where your usage is measured and charged is usually in kilowatt hours. Now, a kilo is 1,000, so 1,000 watts is 1 kW, 1 kilowatt, and 1,000 kilowatts equals 1 megawatt, and similarly, 1,000 kilowatt hours equals 1 megawatt hour. If you think about an average light bulb, an average LED light bulb, it requires about 10 watts to turn on, or 10 watt hours to run for 1 hour. So in 100 hours, that light bulb will have used 1 kilowatt hour. Kind of scaling up the example, a hydropower plant with a capacity, which is their maximum generating output of 1 megawatt instantaneously, 1,000 kilowatts, could help 100,000 light bulbs turn on at the same time. If that plant was on for 3 hours at full capacity, then it could power those 100,000 light bulbs for those 3 hours by producing 3 megawatt hours of electricity. So you might remember, or even still have in your house, the old incandescent light bulbs. Those used up to 10 times the energy of an LED, 100 watts. And so while 90 watts is not that much electricity on its own, the difference between an LED and the old incandescent, those 90 watts across all the light fixtures in your house, across the hundreds of thousands of light fixtures in the state, and over a course of a year, make a real difference in the demand for energy from Vermont and add up to many, many, many megawatt hours of energy we don't no longer need to purchase. I wanted to raise that because while we're going to be talking really about where our supply comes from, we're not going to talk about energy efficiency a whole lot today. And our energy efficiency programs over the last 20 years have reduced Vermont's energy demand by about 15% from what it otherwise would have been. So it really does make a big difference. Last thing I'll say here, and many of you may have known all this slide already, but if we're focused more on consumption in your home, we would be talking about kilowatt hours. But for the rest of the presentation, because we're talking about Vermont scale, we're going to be talking more in megawatt hours. And that's, again, the amount of for when we're talking about the amount of electricity used or generated, and we're going to talk about the number of megawatt hours over the course of whole years when we're moving on in this presentation. So next slide, please. Okay, so now we're really getting into where Vermont's electricity comes from. And first up is what is physically generated within the state. So the chart on the slide shows that Vermont has within its borders mostly renewable sources. And I'm using the term renewable energy here, how it's defined in state statute, and I'm just going to read that. Renewable energy means energy produced using a technology that relies on a resource that is being consumed at a harvest rate at or below its natural regeneration rate. So it's important to just have that specifically there, because the definition of renewable is not something that the Department of Public Service makes up or anybody out in the marketplace. It is defined in Vermont by statute. So in 2021, generators based in Vermont produced about 1.9 million megawatt hours of electricity. So that compares with about 5.8 million megawatt hours that Vermont utilities procured to meet customer needs. That means that the electricity physically generated in Vermont makes up about 1/3 of what's needed to meet Vermont's needs. Now, that doesn't count most of the electricity generated at the large hydro facilities on the Connecticut River. Those are some pretty big facilities. So a lot of electricity is generated physically close to Vermont. Those dams obviously connect to Vermont borders. Their licenses are often in New Hampshire, so they're counted in New Hampshire. But important to note that the proximity of those generating stations. Also important to note that not all of the electricity generated in Vermont is used by or sold to Vermont utilities. So some of this power that's generated here goes out of the state, some power out of the state comes into Vermont. And then I noted this earlier, but I'll mention again that the resources listed here don't necessarily produce electricity at all times of the day of the year or even the same amount. We're going to save the particular characteristics of resources and for the next set of webinars that we're doing. But just as an example, the fossil plants here you see in the state, there's oil, a few oil plants. They really only run for a few hours a year. And that's really usually at the times when demand for electricity is the highest. The solar resources, for example, another example, provide more electricity during the spring and summer seasons and during daylight hours, but not as much at night in the winter. Perhaps some of this is obvious to you all, but next slide, please. So this slide shows you where that generation is actually located in Vermont. Now on the left-hand side, it is Vermont generation by resource type. It excludes small-scale solar, and I'll explain why in a moment. The different colors are related to different sources. For instance, the green on this map are wind resources, the gray are oil, and the blue are hydroelectric resources. And the size of the bubbles are just relate to the size of the capacity of the resource. Again, the amount that they can generate at any one time. There is one large-scale solar sited in Vermont that you can see that's in the yellow in Ludlow, a 20 megawatt facility. But solar isn't included on this map because there's over 17,000 individual solar interconnections on the grid, and that adds up to about 400 or well over 400 megawatts of solar through 2021. And the map on the right kind of shows you how that solar is distributed across the state. You can see in the Champlain Valley, and then again in the Connecticut River Valley by town, there are more resources in those valleys, more solar resources. Combined, the solar resources and the non-solar resources here, roughly at 1,000 megawatts of capacity within the state. Again, that maximum at any one time that could be generated. Vermont's peak demand in 2021, I believe, was around 960 megawatts, just to give you a sense of scale. Next slide, please. So this slide is really to put Vermont's generation and consumption in context. This is what is generated physically in New England, so that doesn't count the imports from Quebec or New York. Over 102 million megawatt hours are generated in New England. About 16% of that electricity came from resources that Vermont considers renewable. Those are highlighted in green on that pie chart. And 27% of the electricity generated in New England comes from nuclear, which is not renewable under Vermont's definition, but is considered carbon-free at the combustion point. Just as a reminder, Vermont had in-state, not counting the Connecticut River, about 2 million megawatt hours of electricity generated and a little under 6 million megawatt hours of consumption. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we get into what electricity Vermont utilities generate or buy, I wanted to set a little context of existing Vermont policy. So utilities are required to undertake something called least cost planning, where they need to meet the need for service at the lowest cost, considering the factors on the screen. So those include things like adequacy of supply, making sure there's enough electricity to supply the need, affordability of rates, cost-effective and efficient use of resources. They need to consider the economic impacts and economic development impacts of their resource choices. Environmental justice and equity, how the burdens of the resource choice and the benefits are distributed across the state. Reliability, ensuring that the lights stay on, and if they go out, that the duration of an outage is short. And sustainability, and that it is electricity is environmentally sound. A lot of these are part of Vermont energy policy as well, that is described in statute. If you go to the next slide. So we want to check in here again and do another poll on how you might prioritize these issues. Now, we've consolidated some of the considerations here, but before we show you the mix of resources the utilities have decided to generate, we wanted to take a minute to see what you think should be prioritized. Now, we recognize that this group isn't a statistically valid sample of Vermonters, so we're not going to be using it to draw firm conclusions. And honestly, we haven't given you a lot of detail on what each of these considerations mean. So take them as what they mean to you, and you should be able to rate each on a scale of very important to not so important, right? I maybe said that backwards. Less important to very important. And we'll give you a minute or two here to finish the poll. So Philip, if you could pull up the poll. And there's 3 questions on here, so please scroll down before you finish. I'll give you just another minute or so to answer this one. And there are a couple of short answer questions if you scroll down to give us a little more context to your answers. Okay, so Philip, if you could close the poll and we'll show some results. Okay, so it looks like for both reliability and sustainable and clean, most participants put in either medium to high priority, and clean was a high priority for those here. I think affordability also had medium and high priority, but a little different breakdown between the high and medium. And so these are really the issues and the criteria that utilities need to consider and the state needs to consider in balance as we think about our electricity supply now and going forward. So I think if we go to the next slide, we can now see what electricity our utilities have generated or bought, following on their decision-making frameworks that they develop in their what's called an integrated resource plan that utilities need to do. So this is separate from what might be located in a utility territory or in Vermont or in New England. This chart is representing the generating resources that utilities either own or contract with to get what I call entitlements to the electricity. So of the total amount, 5.8 million megawatt hours, about 82% of Vermont utility entitlements are carbon free, with 64% coming from renewable sources. You can see about 24% of Vermont's entitlements come from Hydro-Quebec, another 12% from other hydropower in the region, a little less than 10% each for biomass, solar, and wind, and 18% coming from contracts with nuclear plants in New England. Now that gray section is unspecified. These are kind of the net of the market purchases and sales in the ISO New England marketplace. So in any hour, a utility may have enough, may have not quite enough supply to meet their demand, and they can purchase the remainder on the New England marketplace. Similarly, if they have more supply than demand, they can sell the excess on that marketplace. And so that unspecified here is representing that those purchases and sales in the marketplace. I'll talk about the attributes of that power in a minute, but for now you can assume that it's similar to what's generated in New England, which you saw on that slide was mostly natural gas with some other resources mixed in. So again, this chart is what electric utilities purchase or own. Now that accounting is before taking into consideration of who actually owns the environmental attributes of that resource. So if you could go to the next slide. So that attributes of every megawatt hour generated or imported into New England are tracked, the environmental attributes. So whether it's natural gas resource or solar resource, it is assigned the environmental attribute of that resource. Now, if it's renewable, it's assigned what's called a renewable energy certificate or a REC. For every megawatt hour that a generating resource generates, that equals 1 REC. Now, these renewable energy certificates are the mechanism that states across New England use to measure compliance towards their renewable electricity requirements. Those requirements are enacted in what are called renewable portfolio standards, or in Vermont, it's called the Renewable Energy Standard. We'll get into the details of the exact requirements of Vermont's Renewable Energy Standard in our next set of webinars, but going back to renewable energy certificates, the goal of these are to create a revenue stream, or when they're established, the goal of the RECs are to create a revenue stream for development that encourages either new renewable development of desired types or sizes, or continued operation of existing renewable energy resources, or to give credit to utilities that had procured renewable resources prior to the creation of those policy instruments like the Renewable Energy Standard. So for today, it's really important to know that renewable energy certificates can either be bundled with the electricity in a purchase or sale agreement, those entitlements that utilities have in a contract, or they can be sold separately from the electricity. So you can purchase the electricity and the generating resource can sell the renewable energy certificate, the right to claim that megawatt hour as renewable. They could sell it to somebody else. Now, these RECs then serve the purpose of providing a mechanism to demonstrate who owns the characteristics of the power being purchased, and then also to prevent two people or two utilities from claiming credit for the same resource. They can be and are often traded across New England, so across states. So in Vermont, after accounting for the disposition of RECs, next slide, please. Sorry. So in Vermont, after we account for those RECs and who has purchased the right to call their megawatt hours renewable, the accounting changes. And you can see here in this chart, after the disposition of RECs, 71% of Vermont's electricity can legally be called renewable. Another 18% is from nuclear. Utilities actually retire those attributes as well. And importantly, you can see how the mix of that hydroelectric changes. So in the entitlements chart I showed you, Hydro-Quebec was about a quarter of Vermont's supply. After accounting for the disposition of renewable energy credits, Vermont uses Hydro-Quebec power for over 50% of its supply, or the attributes associated with Hydro-Quebec for over 50% of its supply. 3% is solar, down from almost 10% in the previous chart. You can see here, you may remember there were portions of the pie that were from wind or biomass, and those renewable energy credits have been sold by Vermont utilities to entities in other states that needed those or wanted those to comply with their renewable energy standard, or their renewable portfolio standard. I'll say that again, I think, in that so the difference between the previous chart and this one, it shows that Vermont utilities have sold the attributes from some of its purchases and replaced those attributes with other renewable attributes. They do this because they can sell the ones they own from a biomass resource, for example, at a higher value than what they need to pay for a replacement attribute, like perhaps a hydroelectric attribute. The purpose of them doing that is to lower rate pressure and lower costs, but it means that that generating resources that may have been in Vermont, the right to call that renewable, a Vermont renewable resource, has been sold out of state and replaced by a hydro resource. The last thing I'll say on this slide is that this accounting is done across the region, and it's the basis for Vermont and other New England states' greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So Vermont's electricity portfolio, based on this accounting, is a little over 2% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. One thing I forgot to mention is, what is that gray 10%? That's the ISO New England mix. It's often called the residual mix. Those are the attributes of all of the power generated in New England that nobody has claimed. Nobody wants these attributes. And so what that's made up of is mostly natural gas. There is nuclear in that mix, and there's even some hydroelectric resources and some imports in that mix, but mostly natural gas. And that's of the 2%, the state's greenhouse gas emissions that are caused from electricity, they're counted as coming from that gray part on the pie chart. Okay, next slide, please. So I know that can be confusing, and I went slowly over it, but I want to take a pause and let some folks ask some clarifying questions in the chat. I cannot see the chat, so Adam, Chris, you're doing it tonight. Chris, if you can facilitate any questions here, and I'll note we will have some more time to get into kind of more detail broadly on other issues, but specifically on the RECs or what I just covered, clarifying questions.
Sure. I think there's some question about how HQ is treated in other states. I don't know if you can touch on that real briefly. Let me dig up some other questions while you try to answer that.
So when Vermont first passed the statute that defined renewable energy, it essentially includes Hydro-Quebec as renewable energy. That a decade ago, we were the only ones that did that. States in the region have moved towards Vermont's approach of treating Hydro-Quebec as, if not renewable, then clean. So Massachusetts has a clean electricity standard. It's referred to as a Clean E standard, where imports specifically from large hydro qualify as a resource in Massachusetts. This is similar in Connecticut, which also includes nuclear as a clean resource. New York, I haven't talked much about New York, but it does border us. So New York also includes large hydro and nuclear as clean. And that's, as I understand it, that's based on the combustion, the emissions at the time of combustion. And so, the life cycle emissions are perhaps a different metric.
Here's one that just popped up. Can you kind of like what authority determines the carbon freeness or renewability of a certain energy source?
So there's two different answers to that. So the renewability of a source is each generating resource needs to register with what's called the NEPOOL GIS, so Geographic Information System, and that's NEPOOL is New England Power Pool, and that's essentially a tracking system that ensures that that all of New England uses, that ensures that these attributes are not double counted anywhere. And so that's how it's tracked. Each public utility commission needs to certify that resources are qualify or not for their renewable portfolio standard, and it kind of goes down to state jurisdiction level through the Public Utility Commission in terms of renewability of a resource. And then the commission then in turn has followed statutory definitions of what is renewable in making that decision. As far as the greenhouse gas emissions reporting, that is done by the Agency of Natural Resources in Vermont. It's done by the Agency of Natural Resources. Other states all have a state agency designated to publish their greenhouse gas inventory. And the emissions from electricity supply that as published by the Agency of Natural Resources follow a methodology that's considered best practice by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so, and that process is one that accounts for the disposition of renewable energy credits.
I've got a question about how one can sell a REC if you're not also selling the megawatt hour of power that's attached to it.
Right. So it's really so you're selling a generating resource creates a few different products, and the products that are created are the biggest, the ones with the biggest revenue streams are energy, the electricity, capacity, which is the kind of the promise to deliver electricity when the region needs it most. And there's a whole separate market for capacity to ensure that we have enough generation when it's needed. And then the renewable energy credits. And each of those products can be separated. So you could purchase just the electricity, you could purchase electricity and capacity, or you could purchase all three kind of bundled products. And so it really can be separated when utilities, they can enter into a contract for delivering electricity at a certain point in New England. And if they don't also in that contract pay for the renewable attributes or just the attributes of the power, then the generator is free to sell those to somebody else. Renewable portfolio standards, renewable energy standards are a regulatory market, and they're different from the marketplace where you might buy goods or buy products at the supermarket. It's just a market that has been created by the states. And so and again, the purpose of that was to provide revenue streams for renewable energy. And so that creation of this other market, aside from the energy market, is it's layered on top, but it can be separated. I'm not sure how well I explained that, but I hope I got there.
I've got a question about whether or not renewable is defined federally. Is there a federal definition for renewable?
I believe there is. The Environmental Protection Agency probably defines renewable. I have been focused over the last year on Vermont's renewable definition, so I don't know the answer to that.
Maybe, I think just one last one. Maybe you could briefly explain the concept of additionality.
Sure. I think there is. I think it's really just the question of, and so these webinars are really meant to be educational, and this question really gets into a policy realm. And I think the question is really, do the policies in place create new renewable generation and like additional renewable generation? And I think so if you hear that term around additionality, I think that's the question it's trying to answer. And I'm not going to won't go into whether that's the right question or not and how to define that, because it really dives into the policy realm, and we want to keep this this is just the first step in our engagement. We will get there though.
Thank you. I think I will hand things back to Claire. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. If you go to the next slide, please. So we'll have more time for some broader questions, or if you didn't get to your question there. But we actually have one last poll where we like to hear from you as you reflect on the presentation today, and maybe think of if you have any broader questions that you're welcome to drop in the chat. But and I'll ask Philip to pull up the poll in a moment, but it has two questions. One, curious to hear what your biggest takeaway is from today. And then if you heard anything today that surprised you, or that you maybe wish we'd gone into in deeper detail, these will be really helpful for us as we continue to kind of scope out the content for our future webinars, and also our engagement opportunities and discussions through the rest of this year. So Philip, if you can launch that poll, give folks a couple moments to think about that. And again, we'll have more time for questions after this. So if you've got some more, feel free to drop those in the chat as well. I really appreciate folks taking the time to share some thoughts with us. This will be, again, really informative for us as we continue to move forward with these efforts. So we'll give folks just another few minutes to put some thoughts together and hit submit, and then we'll get ready to move into another broader question and discussion session. All right, Philip, and just one last moment for folks to wrap up, and then if you can close the poll. All right, next slide, please. So we just wanted to circle back to our objectives. As TJ mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we're hoping that this, is the first in our 3-part webinar series. So really, we're hoping to start by grounding in some of the facts and data related to our current electric system. So we hope that you learned about or refreshed your information on some core components of how the electric grid delivers electricity to Vermont homes and businesses, and saw a couple different perspectives on how we understand where Vermont's electricity comes from. And we'll be looking forward to reviewing.
My pronouns are she, her, and
And then, Chris, if you go to the next slide. Looks like we have about 10 more minutes to answer any questions we didn't get to or any broader questions beyond just clarifying questions that we've been asking so far.
I think we've got one, Tim asking about kind of describing a typical day in nice ISO New England, describing the generation sources. So maybe we can explain kind of how sources or generators are called as needed through ISO New England's processes.
Sure. That is that's a softball to end on. Oh wait, it's a so the ISO New England markets are pretty complicated. I'm not going to be able to answer that completely in a couple of minutes here, but I'll try to give a sense. ISO New England, their goal in operating the markets is to have the least cost resources be chosen, and the markets that participate are usually bigger resources, so under 5 megawatts, not exclusively, but mostly, just operate all of the time. So the solar resources on your roofs or small solar arrays are, from ISO's perspective, small enough to be behind the transmission meter, and so they're kind of operating all the time. And so ISO New England looks at the demand for the region and breaks it out by kind of load zones, and takes the net of that, the demand minus those behind the meter resources, so that kind of net load, and says, okay, this is what we need to meet, and we need to meet it at least cost. And so they run a marketplace where generators will bid in and say, they'll raise their hand and say, I'll serve that demand for free, because I may have a contract somewhere else that's paying me to generate. So in the marketplace, I'm going to serve it for free. The next generator may say, hey, I'm going to serve that demand for $10 per megawatt hour. And the next one may say $20, and so on and so on. And ISO New England will accept every generator up until the point where they have enough generation to meet the demand needs. And then once they do that, say that generator that bid $70 a megawatt hour, 7 cents a kilowatt hour to produce power, if they're the last one to meet the demand, then everybody who bid before them and got selected gets paid that 7 cents or that $70 a megawatt hour. And ISO New England will dispatch plants based on that price. Now, if that scenario, I haven't talked about kind of where those resources are located and if there are transmission constraints to get the power from one place to another. So there could be a constraint. Often in Maine has a lot of power that generally flows south to the Boston area, and sometimes that power can't all get out of Maine. And so ISO New England will have to say, hey, that next generator was in Maine, but they are not, we're not able to get the power down to Boston, so we're going to take this higher cost generator and dispatch them because they're in Worcester, Mass, or somewhere near Boston, where the power may be able to get there. And so on a hour to hour, minute to minute basis, ISO New England is in their control room making these types of decisions. Hopefully that gives some light on it and wasn't a too complicated way to say. I think that's like one aspect of how ISO New England operates. I haven't seen much of the chat, but I do think the suggestions to go to the ISO New England website and the ISO Express dashboards are good ones. There's a lot of great information there on what's operating at any one time. And yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
I'll try to give you an easy one now. Is there one control site that is ISO?
That one is actually an easier one. They are located in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and it's one grid site. Now each, and that again is the really high voltage transmission lines. Each transmission company, like Velco, has a control center also for its operation of its lines, but they really are taking direction from ISO New England on how to operate their lines. And then Velco operates them and does the maintenance on them. Some of our distribution utilities have control centers, like Green Mountain Power or Swanton Electric have control centers where they can manage their own systems. And then some of the smaller utilities don't have that type of control center.
Can we tell the folks here how many Canadian high voltage lines come into Vermont?
That's a good question. There's a high voltage direct current line that comes into Highgate. That's 225 megawatts of power that comes in, and it's called a transformer that switches that to kind of the alternating current power that is, allows it to be distributed around the grid in New England and, all the way to your home. There is another transmission line that kind of crosses the northeast corner of the state in or near Canaan. And I'm going to look away from my screen for a second just to look at a map on my wall. I think those are the two main ones that come into Vermont. I will note that there was a transmission line that was permitted by the Public Utility Commission called the New England Clean Power Link that you may recall this 4 or 5 years ago. It was permitted to go at the bottom of Lake Champlain, down the lake, and then underground across Vermont to the Cavendish area. That is permitted, but has not been built for a number of reasons. Although there's, you may have seen in the news, it has come back to life a little bit.
Maybe to wrap up what I know has been a long day for you, maybe we could briefly speak to how we're going to ensure reliability as we move to a more and more renewable generation portfolio.
Sure. It's a great question. I think it is, the responsibility for reliability lies at a number of different levels. So I mentioned the responsibility that ISO New England has at a kind of high voltage level. There's also a responsibility by our distribution utilities in Velco for kind of managing the lines to prepare for kind of the more severe storms that we have been getting and will get as we go forward here. So vegetation management, potential undergrounding of lines, and those are kind of the traditional solutions, but we're really looking a lot into how can load management help. So by load management, I mean a number of things there. There's a number of tools in that toolbox, like battery storage that could be at a home level or at kind of a utilities substation, or even at the transmission level, having storage to ensure that if a generating supply gets cut off, then there's another resource there available, at least in a short duration, to kind of pick up the slack. There's the ability to manage our demand through rates. We think about electrification of the transportation sector, and there's electric vehicles. Well, smart rate design can encourage the charging of those vehicles to happen at times of lower cost and lower demand on the grid. And so that's another tool in the toolbox. There's other tools like demand response, which is essentially paying people to reduce their load when they're asked. There's other controls that can be that can help manage load. So, and some of these aren't new. Water heaters have been controllable for some time and have been controlled in Vermont, where if you sign up for the appropriate rate, you may get a small discount on your rate for your water heater, but the utility can, at times of high cost or high demand, cycle your water heater so that the customer doesn't feel any or much difference in the service that's being provided, the hot water, but the demand over tens of thousands of water heaters, the utility could cycle that demand over, the first 10,000 are shut off for 15 minutes, and then the next, those go back on, and the next 10,000 water heaters are shut off for 15 minutes, and so on and so on. So it kind of can lower those peak needs. There's and it's ensuring that we have the generating resources that match the time of demand. And so we want to focus our support for resources. We want to investigate focusing our support for resources on kind of the time and locational value of those resources. So are they worth more at certain times of the day? Are they worth more at certain times of the year? Or is a resource worth more if it's located in southern Vermont versus northern Vermont? And those are all policy questions that, they're really good questions. And I think that we need to work hopefully through this engagement process and then through, traditional legislative and regulatory processes to answer those questions.
Claire, I'll send it back to you to kind of wrap up.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for bearing with us. We are going to save the chat, so if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, we will have it. We'll think about how we can build some of that information into, again, future engagement sessions and the next sessions in our webinar series. So if you move to the next slide, please. As TJ mentioned, this is the first in our 3-part webinar series. So we'll be taking a break next week, and then we'll be back with our second session that focuses on our current renewable electricity policies and programs. So getting into the details of some of what our core policies and programs are and how they have helped promote renewable electricity to date. Those are February 14th and 15th. And then we have what will be in March, we're calling a parking lot session to deal with some of these questions that we didn't have time or space to get into in detail during our first 2 sessions, and we'll be announcing the topics for those. I will note we've changed the dates of one of them due to an unforeseen conflict. So if you've already registered for the session, what was previously Thursday, March 9th, that has been shifted to March 15th, and your registration will be automatically shifted. So you should receive a notification if you've already registered for one of those sessions. So next slide, please. With that, we really just want to thank you again for taking the time out of your night to come ask these great questions, and we hope that you'll stay engaged with our effort. You can, if you're not already on our stakeholder list, email us at the email on this slide to reach out with any further questions or comments, or again, to be added to our mailing list. So thanks again, and we hope we'll see you in the future.